Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks to the AIC. It's great to be back here again for another annual conference, this theme being transnational, serious and organised crime. So that is the title of the talk, Simulating Network Disruption. We've tested a range of interventions that I'm going to talk about today. It is part of a larger project though, and I really just want to give this context before I get too much into the specific paper that I'm talking about today. So the project is called Using Network Science Analytics for Identifying, Anticipating and Disrupting Covert Threats, Covert Illicit Networks. It's funded by the Office of National Intelligence, National Intelligence Discovery Grant Scheme. We've got a multidisciplinary team working on this project. So there's myself, David, who you've just spoken to, and a couple of colleagues in data science and mathematics from now Adelaide University, not University of Adelaide. That project has four key aims, essentially. We've looked at aiming to construct a set of empirically informed simulated networks that are based on the properties of actual networks. So they're empirically informed simulated data. We want to then develop a series of techniques informed by social network analysis to look at disrupting those networks and over time identifying which interventions are more effective under what conditions and what the potential consequences of those interventions are likely to be. The talk I'm giving today is one component of that study. The methods I'm talking about today could be transferred to a range of different types of crime. The context for today's presentation is drug trafficking. It's good that I'm speaking after Ed this morning because Ed talked a lot about networks and the difference between hierarchical structures and the assumptions we make around how organised crime groups might organise their activities. A network perspective operationalises that. So we don't assume anything with respect to structure. If there's any assumption that would hold for a network perspective, it is that when you are looking at an organisation, the network is the organisation. Every organisation is underpinned by social networks. Social network analysis is a set of techniques to actually determine the structure of those networks and make some observations about how they form, function, operate, behave, etc. So a network perspective today is applying social network analysis, which is a series of mathematical techniques to actually unpack the structural and relational properties of those networks. Prior research in this space has done some work around looking at which interventions are more or less effective at disrupting crime and criminal groups. For our context, most of that research has applied one or two, perhaps three different metrics. We've added to some of those metrics, but as I mentioned at the start, we're also simulating models, and no study has systematically compared the different types of interventions I'm talking about, nor have they used simulation approaches. The overarching aim of this particular paper is to look at the relative effectiveness of social network analysis informed disruption strategies applied to these drug trafficking networks. So here are the different networks that have informed our simulated models. I'm not going to get into them too much. You can just take a look for a moment and see how they actually operate and structured. They look quite different, in other words. So this one here is quite different in particular because if you take out just a couple of key actors or nodes, that network is split into two. That has different implications for thinking about disruption than some of these other ones that are quite differently organised. So the data for these come from published studies that have been assembled by the Mitchell Centre for Social Network Analysis at the University of Manchester. From those networks, here are some of the descriptive statistics. I'm not going to get into those too much either, but the nodes show that the networks have different size, they're of different size, the edges are the ties between those nodes, the density, again, is just a calculation of the overall potential for edges in a network compared to what are actually present. All of those have simply informed the simulation models that we've developed using ERGMs, exponential random graph models. So from each of those 8 different networks, we developed 1,000 different simulated varieties of those networks and then ran the disruption techniques that I'll talk about in the next slide to assess the implications of those disruptions. Ideally, using a broader data set and using simulation approaches, we're aiming to make some generalizable observations about which of the disruption strategies that we're looking at are more or less effective and under what conditions. The 6 interventions that we've used, I'll talk about in a moment. The way in which we determined the outcome of disruption is when those interventions remove 20% of actors per network, plus isolates, which are individual actors who are no longer connected. We recalculated the metrics after each of those stages. I think if I pause for a moment, when we are talking about disruption, it is pretty incumbent upon us, I think, everyone in this room and others, to really begin to think at a much deeper level about how we might be able to observe and measure the effects of disruption. It's one thing to assume that if we do something, it's going to have an impact on the crime group's ability to operate, continue with their activities. But it's too easy to call everything a disruption if we're not actually able to assess what the impact of that disruption might be. If there's one thing we've heard about in the last day and a half so far, it's that the criminal groups are going to adapt, and how they adapt is going to have different consequences for how we think about what the actual impact of any disruption strategy might be. So in a network sense, we're taking a relatively restricted view of how we would define and operationalise disruption, because we are able to measure the changes in a network following the interventions that I'm talking about. So we calculated outcome metrics. There's 3 metrics per step. The proportion of the largest connected component remaining, which is the size of that larger connected group that still exists within a network. The proportion of the network size remaining, these are both structural indicators or outcome measures that we've looked at, and then there's a functional one as well, which is a proportion of broken shorter paths, which is the capacity for a member of one edge of a network compared to the other, the number of steps they would need to go through to communicate. And then we compared these interventions, and the comparison is what I'll be talking about. So here are the intervention strategies. The 3 on the left are the ones that have really featured in the literature so far, and the bottom one on the right, which is cut sets. So degree centrality, remove the number of actors with the highest number of connections first, and then see what happens. The betweenness centrality, we talked about brokers. I think Ed's talked about it, David's talked about it. So betweenness centrality is a way to identify where brokers lie in a network. Eigenvector is a measure of identifying which actors are connected to other really important actors in a network. So you remove those and assess the implications. Backbone is a concept that's used in network science generally, but it has not been applied in criminological studies so far. It's this idea that there is a core, well, I guess using the analogy of spine, a backbone to a network. And we were wanting to assess, okay, does this have disruptive potential as well? If you're able to identify it mathematically and then target the backbone, the core spine of a network, what's the potential impact for disruption? And then cut sets, which are a subgroup of 2 or more actors whose removal sort of splits the network in 2, which is why I gave that sort of brief example of the network that I showed on the far left. And that has potential utility in networks that are structured that way, perhaps less so in others. So here are just Yes, you can read it. I can't on that. Some of the figures, so each of the numbers here, just the number of steps that are involved, and the lines down the bottom are just showing how quickly they were able to remove the 20% component of the network that we have identified as our measure for this outcome. So the different colours, the red and blue are the degree in betweenness, and the others, as you can see, just showing the different number of steps involved. So essentially here, degree in betweenness, centrality produced the greatest reduction in the overall largest connected component. We really need to get into the descriptive statistics around that. But cut set and backbone random lagged much further behind others, and even backbone betweenness, which we expected would have utility, or significant utility going into the study, it lagged behind degree in betweenness, and eigenvector was overall around in the middle. In relation to reduction in network size, we saw a similar pattern. So degree betweenness tended to work the most for each of the networks. Eigenvector was fairly close, fairly competitive, but the backbone measures were less so. And I should mention, hopefully you're able to read that on an earlier slide, we compared all of this against just a random removal process as well. And the proportion of broken paths, similar trends here. Degree and betweenness broke majority, 90% plus of shortest paths by the final step. Eigenvector was close, but not to the same. The novel metrics broke of backbone and backbone betweenness were having some impact, but much less. And cut set and backbone random performed modestly above the random baseline, but not much better overall. Here, this is just a figure which basically demonstrates what I've just gone over. The order in which they were most effective is on the left, and to the right was random. So betweenness, degree were clearly the higher performing strategies if you're wanting to disrupt a network in the shortest number of steps. Eigenvector was next. Backbone betweenness and backbone random cut set were similar. They had different effectiveness for different measures. So I want to just try to unpack some of this for a moment to reflect. And on the next slide, I'll talk about what some of the potential outcomes might be for people in the room. And if you are using network analysis in your job, in law enforcement context, please come and speak to us afterwards. So centrality-based strategies dominate, which is the main group of strategies that have been tested in the existing literature so far. Betweenness, degree and eigenvector centrality consistently outperformed all the non-centrality approaches across all 8 networks. So there's really 8 times 1,000 of each of those networks. All 3 metrics at all levels. No single centrality measure is clearly superior. So while degree and betweenness sort of alternated a little bit as clearly being the 2 standout approaches, they were ultimately quite interchangeable. Eigenvector centrality was competitive, and that hasn't really featured in much of the literature so far. Given overlapping ranges, the choice between them, if you are in the position of mapping a network operationally and you want to identify what approaches might have the biggest impact to disrupt that network's ability to operate, the choice between these would likely be influenced by what options are available to you in that particular context, more than trying to identify the optimum strategy. Network backbone, which we hoped would have significant utility, did not to the same extent as the 3 that I just mentioned, except in some examples dependent on that particular network structure. So that highlights the need to have a really good understanding of what the structural dynamics of the network that you're going after are before you would think about what and how you might seek to disrupt it. So the structural moderator here is degree centralisation. That emerged as being a key consideration for thinking about how you might go about trying to disrupt any network. Networks with high centralisation were more vulnerable to targeted centrality removal than others. So implications in future research. So for law enforcement, I think I just really mentioned this. If you're aiming to disrupt a network, betweenness degree and eigenvector centrality are all defensible targeting choices. All of them are included in many of the software approaches that you use. The other strategies that I've talked about are not. So the data don't favour one over the other. A choice between centrality measures should be guided ultimately by what options are available to you, what information you have, ultimately seeking to disrupt a network may be opportunistic in some way. So actually marrying these strategies to your options that are available to you in that particular context would be useful. We think eigenvector centrality would hold potential utility for thinking about infiltrating a network, such as inputting undercover agents, for instance. If you can identify which individuals are connected to other really important, influential individuals, which in the figures I demonstrated earlier, the larger the nodes is just weighted by the degree, the number of their ties. Then placing those informants or placing those undercover agents next to those individuals so they can build relationships will allow them to gain an understanding of the structure of the network much more quickly than if they were placed in other areas of the network. So, directions for future research. We want to look at empirically testing eigenvector centrality's utility as an infiltration tool beyond disruption, as I just mentioned. We'd like to ultimately look at combining strategies. So the study that I talked about looked at applying each strategy to each set of networks independently. It might well be that some of these work best in combination, and they will work better in combination when you know more about the structural properties of a particular network. We want to extend this to larger and more diverse network data sets. One example is cybercrime, looking at extremism or terrorist groups as well as part of this project. And if you are comparing disrupting a drug trafficking group to a terrorist group, you would think about it differently because in our study, as I mentioned, we've treated isolates as no longer components of a network. If you're looking at it in the context of terrorism, you wouldn't want to do that because you don't know what those isolates are going to do. This is the harder part. We want to look at really understanding how networks are likely to adapt to the strategies that we're putting to them. And the adaptation is challenging to model, but we're working through that. And at the same time, ultimately, we'd like to look at incorporating missing data techniques as part of that component, both missing actors and missing ties. And integrating temporal dynamics. So how do these interventions decay, if they do at all, over time, and what and how would we think about that? So I will leave it there. Thank you.